The CFM Rise is a very promising technological step that's been decades in the making. And whilst the technology to make such engines work wasn't available in the past, everything now seems to be in place, including, most importantly, strong interest from Boeing and Airbus. Or so we thought. So why could that be changing? Well, a lot of promising developments run into trouble as they get closer to production. So is the CFM Rise still as realistic now as it seemed to be, say, 2 or 3 years ago? Well, today we're going to look at what's the latest on this engine, and we're going to see what its opponents take issue with. Now, we have looked at the CFM Rise and what makes it special in previous videos on the channel. But for those who haven't seen it before, let's start explaining what exactly this is. RISE is actually an acronym for Revolutionary Innovation for Sustainable Engines, because let's face it, aircraft don't get airborne without acronyms. But ultimately, it's a group of engine technologies centered around a type of jet engine that has many names. Prop fan, or open rotor, or unducted fan, or even open fan. There's quite a few. And the name seems to vary depending on the engine maker. So here I'll mostly use the term open fan since that's what CFM use. Now CFM is a 50-50 joint venture between General Electric in the US and Safran in France. In essence, the open fan works just like the turbofan engines that all new jetliners have, except that it's missing a significant part. Its outer nacelle or casing, which normally surrounds a turbofan engine. As we've explained in many videos on the channel, only a small fraction of the air entering the front of the turbofan engine actually goes through the core. The vast majority of the air goes through the big fan at the front and then bypasses the core of the engine. And the ratio of the air that goes through the core versus the air that bypasses it is called the bypass ratio. Now, in very simple terms, for our engine to be as efficient as possible, we want the bypass ratio to be as high as possible. For example, if you compare the CFM 56 that powers all 737 NGs and many legacy Airbus A320s with the newer CFM LEAP engine that powers the 737 MAX and the Airbus A320 neo, you'll see that the LEAP has a much higher bypass ratio, nearly double actually, depending on which specific aircraft models we compare. Again, I am oversimplifying things here because there's more features that make these engines super efficient. But the point here is that there are practical limits to how far we can increase the bypass ratio of a turbofan. For one, the newer CFM LEAP is considerably heavier than the older CFM 56, and a big reason for this is the need for a much larger nacelle to surround that much bigger fan at the front. And that, as you may have guessed, is where the open fan architecture comes in. By eliminating the nacelle, the open fan can be significantly lighter, and that in itself helps improve efficiency. But there's an even bigger gain to be made here. Without that nacelle, the fan at the front can be significantly larger, effectively pushing the bypass ratio much higher. Plus, since the tips of the fans don't need to fit so tightly to an outer casing, the blades can be made to have variable pitch, boosting efficiency even further. And as far as we've been able to find, there aren't any turbofans out there with variable pitch in their fan blades. But if you know better, let us know in the comments below, and hit the like and subscribe while you're down there. Anyway, all this means is that open fan engines could be around 20 to 25% more efficient than turbofans producing the same thrust, which is pretty amazing considering that the newest generation of turbofans that entered service boast gains of around 15 to 20%. But the thing is, engineers and aircraft designers have known of the potential benefits of open fan engines for a while now. In previous videos, we saw that GE and Pratt & Whitney Allison both tried such designs in the late 1980s and early 90s. And both Boeing and Douglas studied plans to launch aircraft with such engines that ultimately went nowhere. But why? Well, basically, the technology just wasn't ready yet. For this to work, the bare fan blades would need to be spinning slower to be efficient. But it was still difficult to design gear reduction mechanisms that could handle the right amount of power reliably. Also, those fan blades would need to be super strong and really lightweight. So if one breaks off after, say, a bird strike, for example, it would have as little energy as possible, which reduces the damage to the wing or the fuselage. This meant that the fan blades would need to be made of a lightweight composite, which was still a very new concept back in the early 1990s. And finally, those early open fans had a pretty serious problem. They were loud, and I mean seriously loud. They were worse than the low bypass engines of that era, which are much noisier than the engines we're all used to today. Now, part of the reason for all that noise was the high rotation speed of those fan blades, which, like I said, would later be reduced when gearboxes became more reliable and more efficient. But another reason was that these engines had two counter-rotating fans to avoid energy losses from the swirling airflow of a single fan. However, in the last decade or so, progress in design and computing power meant that engineers could replace the rear of the two fans with a non-rotating set of variable pitch blades that ultimately de-swirl the airflow to regain efficiency whilst also reducing noise. And another advantage is that it also reduces the cost and complexity of these engines, since the gearbox now only has to take care of a single fan. And if you want more details on this, you can check out Bjorn Firm's writing on Liam News, which is actually one of the sources we really value here on this channel, or you can watch the first video that Petter made on the CFM Rise. Now, we recently made a video on turboprops where we explained that thanks to this simplified single fan design, function-wise, the Rise is kind of a turboprop, although it's obviously designed for much higher cruise speeds than turboprops generally fly at. But having said that, some turboprop engines have been made with counter-rotating props, including some with very high cruise speeds. Again, we can see that the lines are really being blurred between these kinds of engines. But what you need to know for this video is that the CFM Rise today is much better placed to succeed where previous open fan engines failed. And that's primarily because we now have reliable gearboxes for fans. We know how to make strong, lightweight fan blades from carbon fiber composites, and we have the know-how and the computing power to design efficient and simple open fans with only one fan disc, which is why there's such strong interest in these engines now. And for its part, CFM says that it's devoted over 2,000 engineers to the Rise program. So what's wrong? Are Boeing and Airbus having second thoughts? Well, I'll tell you after this. Whilst researching this video, my team and I poured through dozens of aviation documents. And it wasn't until we took a closer look that we noticed some just didn't seem quite right. And it turned out that they were actually AI generated. But what's most terrifying is that they all use real personal information to seem as convincing as possible, like names, job titles, addresses, even family details. When someone can buy your personal information online for just a few dollars, they can craft incredibly convincing misinformation and put you at risk of scamming, harassment, identity theft, and fraud. That's exactly why my editor Dom signed up for Delete Me, the sponsor of today's video. Delete Me chases down and removes your personal data from every corner of the internet, and you don't need to lift a finger. But what he loves most about Delete Me is their automated monitoring system. Even after they remove your data, they keep checking to make sure that it doesn't pop up again. They also send regular reports showing exactly where Dom's information was found and removed. In this era of AI-generated misinformation, keeping your personal data private is more important than ever before. And if you want to see what's out there about you, head to joindeleteme.com/mentor now or scan this QR code. If you're in the US, use code MENTOR now for 20% off. A big thank you to Delete Me for sponsoring this video. Now, let's get back to the story. The latest news that we have on the CFM Rise came from this year's Paris Air Show, which took place last June. In the lead up to the show, CFM briefed the world's press that the new engine's development program is picking up pace, and they gave more details on the kind of milestones that they've reached so far. 350 key tests were completed, adding up to 3,000 hours of endurance tests for different sections of the engine, including its blades. To do this, GE has been conducting tests for the Rise program using other engines like the military F110 that normally powers the F-16 or F-15 fighters, or the GE Passport, which is a business jet engine. The Passport is one of GE's newest engines and will be a central part of the first working CFM Rise demonstrator. All of this testing with life-size or scaled engines and models is done in various European sites, and crucially, much of it is done in partnership with Airbus. in some cases using Airbus's own facilities like the one in Filton, England. And ground trials of the engine are expected as early as next year. Now, all of this is interesting, but at the same time, we've also had some strong counterpoints on the prospects of the CFM Rise from CFM's competitor, Pratt & Whitney. And to be honest, it kind of sounded a bit like healthy banter between competitors. A Pratt & Whitney rep in Paris said that despite their apparent advantages, in practice, open fan engines just won't be as efficient as next generation turbofan engines. So why is that? What does in practice mean here? Well, this has to do with efficiency losses and compromises in the aircraft's design that have to be made in order to integrate a different engine. Now, smaller compromises that bring in efficiencies aren't new in aircraft design. I've already mentioned that the higher weight of the newer high bypass turbofans as an example, where we accept extra weight for core engine efficiency gains. So let's see what Pratt & Whitney says about the CFM Rise and open fan engines in general in this regard. Firstly, Pratt & Whitney argues that there will still need to be some strengthening in the structure of the fuselage to protect against blade out events. That's the scenario where the blade detaches from the engine and strikes the fuselage. However, the blades will be made of composites that are less likely to suffer fatigue-related cracks, and they're going to be lighter and spinning slower than the fan blades of other jet engines, which means that they'll have less energy if they do break off after, say, a bird strike. Still, some strengthening of the fuselage may well be a certification requirement for an aircraft like this. But it's worth noting here that we don't necessarily require this for turboprops today. These aircraft do have strengthening in the sides of the fuselage that are close to the propellers, but this is mainly to protect the fuselage from ice shedding off of the propeller blades, not from the blades themselves. In any case, such strengthening would add weight, and more weight will also likely be added for the construction of the wings of these planes, assuming of course that the engines are mounted under the wing. In a previous video, we looked at a leaked Airbus image of a concept aircraft whose wings bent upwards near where they meet the fuselage before bending back down further outwards in a kind of gull wing profile. And this was because of the need to create some room under the wing for the large diameter fan of an engine like the CFM Rise. And while that would work, it would still add weight to the wing structure compared to a simpler wing with a modern aerofoil. Also, designing a wing like this could require compromises in the aerofoil itself. Modern wings tend to have thin and flexible structures. Will that bent inboard wing section need to be thicker as well as heavier to make that gull wing shape structurally possible? Well, we don't really know yet. And finally, Pratt & Whitney pointed out that these modern sleek wings we now see work best with super smooth, undisturbed air flowing over them, ideally with a laminar flow, especially over the wing's upper surface. That's not really an issue with wing-mounted turbofans, but with open fans, the upper side of the wing directly behind the fan will definitely have disturbed airflow, which will likely reduce the wing's efficiency. And this is obviously a factor too with turboprop engines, as Bjorn Firm explains in Liam News, especially since turboprops don't have a stationary set of blades behind the fan to de-swirl the airflow. But turboprops fly at much slower speeds, so the drag penalty from that airflow over the wing doesn't hurt them as much. So let's just recap here. An airliner with an open fan engine like the CFM Rise would need a strengthened fuselage to guard against bird strikes, a heavier wing structure to make a gull wing shape possible, and some losses from compromised airflow on the upper surface of the wing behind the engines. Now again, that's what Pratt & Whitney says. So what's the counter argument to these points? Well, the theory here is that an engine like the CFM Rise would bring efficiency improvements of around 20 to 25%. But the raw efficiency gains of the engine itself could be much higher than this, maybe as high as 30%. So CFM believes that overall, after factoring all of the aircraft integration losses, the net efficiency gain could still be around the 20% mark. Even so, CFM openly admits that integrating this engine into an airframe would require close work and coordination between engine and aircraft manufacturers, which explains why Airbus is engaged in the testing and development of the Rise engine even as early as, well, now, way before the official launch of a specific new engine or aircraft. Which brings me to the aircraft manufacturers, Boeing and Airbus, and their stance towards the CFM Rise. Because there is some recent news on that front, and not all of it from the Paris Air Show. When it comes to Boeing, for a while now, it's been pretty hard to figure out what they can do with a new engine, because we just don't know when they're going to launch a new aircraft. Now, back in May, Boeing CEO Kelly Ortberg gave an interview to Aviation Week where he explained that the company needs to answer 3 questions in order to make a decision on when to launch a new plane to replace the Boeing 737. First, when is the market ready for a new airliner? Second, when is the technology ready? And third, when will Boeing be ready and capable of financially handling a new aircraft launch? At the time, Ortberg said that Boeing simply isn't ready to go ahead on all 3 of these points. But during the Paris Air Show, Boeing seemed to be exploring one of these points, and they did it publicly. Boeing issued a request for information to all engine makers for an engine in the £30,000 thrust range for a future new aircraft. And that is the thrust range that Boeing would need for a 737 replacement. Their request is believed to be addressed to Pratt & Whitney, Rolls-Royce, who recently started working on a smaller ultrafan, as we've already seen in another video, and of course to GE and Safran, who make up CFM. However, here's where things start to not look so good for the CFM Rise. Boeing's RFI specifically asks for advanced ducted propulsion systems in that thrust range, so no open fan. But with that said, this is not the first time over the last few years at least that Boeing has asked for such information from engine manufacturers, which means that they're maybe simply testing the water, working to answer Ortberg's 3 questions. But on the other hand, the requests basically for a conventional ducted turbofan seems to show which way Boeing's engineers are headed. Although it's important to stress here that this was just a request for information. For all we know, Boeing might want to just compare this information on the new ducted engines with information on the CFM Rise that they've been getting separately. So that's Boeing. But what about Airbus? We've seen how close they've been working with CFM on the open fan, and the plan was to test the first Rise prototype on the Airbus A380 testbed. So what's changed? Well, a few weeks after the Paris Air Show, Airbus announced that Airbus Commercial Aircraft CEO Christian Schoerer will retire after 40 years with the company. And crucially, Schoerer has been a big fan of the open fan within the company. So with his retirement, the Rise engine loses an ally. Schoerer's replacement is Lars Wagner, an engineer who's been the CEO of MTU Aero Engines in Germany for a couple of years and worked for Airbus before that. So what does Wagner think about the CFM Rise? Well, MTU is a key supplier and an engineering and research partner to Pratt & Whitney. And according to Scott Hamilton in Liam News, Wagner's own position on the prospects of a modern open fan engine basically mirrors those of Pratt & Whitney. And here it's worth pointing out that Airbus has always wanted 2 engine options for a single-aisle aircraft. And if they insist on the same strategy for their next aircraft, this would mean that both versions would need to fit the same aircraft, either open fans or ducted fans. One of each just simply wouldn't work because, again, open fans need a specific wing design. And since that design would come with weight and performance penalties, using it on a plane with a regular ducted turbofan just wouldn't make any sense. Hamilton has also revealed that CFM is working on a backup, more conventional ducted engine using the same technologies developed in the Rise program, such as the geared fan, the miniaturized engine core, and the more extended use of modern high-temperature ceramic matrix composites, or CMCs. Guy Norris in Aviation Week believes that the ducted version of the CFM Rise is called the Advance. But here's the more interesting part. CFM isn't the only company with a backup idea for a future engine. Pratt & Whitney, despite all of their trash talking of the Rise engine, are quietly studying such an engine themselves. This is actually a project run by Pratt & Whitney Canada, who normally work on turboprop engines, and it involves an engine with some hybridization for a regional aircraft called the MAVE MJ500 that would carry between 76 and 100 passengers. And as these pictures show, this engine is basically a small open fan with a single fan disc and a set of non-rotating de-swirling stators behind it, just like the CFM Rise. As it turns out, even though Pratt & Whitney believe that making further improvements in modern turbofans is the way to go for the next generation of airliners, they know that if CFM's bet with the Rise pays off, then they don't want to be left behind. So they are working on something, albeit for a different segment of airliners. Finally, let's not forget Embraer. They decided against the launch of a turboprop regional aircraft with rear-mounted engines just like the Maeve because no suitable engines were available. But if Pratt & Whitney Canada goes ahead with a new engine, that could all change. But what do you think? How likely do you think it is that we'll see a version of the CFM Rise in service in the next few years? Do you think that CFM and the aircraft makers will manage to cancel out all of those aircraft integration challenges? Let me know in the comments below. I'm Ben Watts, you're watching Mentor Now. Have an amazing week, and I'll see you next time.